Hello, I'm Renae from the Pear homestead, and today I'm going to be making some homemade pear butter in my slow cooker. I have a homestead near Kickapoo, Illinois, and it used to be my grandparents, and they planted a pear tree a long time ago. So these are antique pears that grow on the homestead. They get really nice and big, and they're firm, but they're delicious. And a lot of them have some little spots in them. So we have some that are good for just fresh eating, but some we've had to cut up to cut the bad spots out, and this is a really good way to use those up. You can make pear butter that you put on breads and sandwiches, just like you might make apple butter. And the slow cooker is a really good way to cook it down without having to stand over the stove. So I thought I'd show you all how to do it. Here I have everything I'm going to use to make the pear butter. I've got my slow cooker, it's a standard size. My pears, some that have already been cut, some bad spots out and stored in the fridge for a few days. I'm going to be adapting a recipe from this book called Preserving Summer's Bounty. It's a nice book with recipes and canning methods, all sorts of things. And then the other ingredients that I'm going to add to the pear butter: lemon juice, apple cider vinegar, cinnamon, honey, nutmeg, and allspice. Before you get started, as always with any food preparation and especially preservation, make sure that you've washed your hands and that your workspace is clean. The first step for making pear butter is pretty simple. To just chop up your pears, you're going to want to remove the cores and any blemishes that you have in your pears. You can do the same thing with apple butter. I make apple butter in the slow cooker all the time. Apple butter and pear butter, sort of just like apple sauce, except that you cook it more, so it gets a little bit more caramelized, and then it's a thicker consistency, and you can use it as a spread on whatever you want. I don't really recommend using a slow cooker overnight to make apple sauce if you want it to be like a side dish, because it will cook too much usually. You can do this overnight if you want to make apple butter or pear butter in a slow cooker overnight. You want to have your slow cooker on low. I'm doing it during the day today. I just don't want to stand over the stove. So instead of cooking it in a saucepan on the stove, I've got my slow cooker on high. And it'll cook faster that way. It should be done in probably a few hours. I'll find out. But I'll be able to check it throughout the day and stir it every once in an hour or so. So that's why I'm choosing to do it on high. You can do it on low as well. So I'm leaving my skin on my pears. It'll get real soft, and I'll whiz it up with an immersion blender if there's chunks of skin left. But I think it'll probably cook down really well, so you won't notice the texture. So I'm basically going to chop up enough pears to fill up my slow cooker, because I have a bunch I want to use up. And then I'm going to adjust my seasoning to accommodate the amount of pears I end up with. So I'll be back in a minute. All right, as you can see, I've filled up my slow cooker with chopped pears, and I cut out any blemishes and the cores, and I left the skins on. Now I'm going to add the other ingredients. I have about 10 pears in here, so I'm doubling the recipe that was in my recipe book, because that called for 5 pears. So I'll just double the other ingredients. So I'll put in 4 tablespoons of lemon juice. And 4 tablespoons of honey. I frequently don't actually measure my honey with a tablespoon because it makes the measuring spoon so sticky, and then you can't reuse it easily. So I just kind of eyeball it. It won't affect the cannability of the recipe or safeness in any way. I need 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. And a half teaspoon of allspice. The spices you can adjust after you've cooked it down. You can sort of taste and decide if you want to add a little more cinnamon, or maybe if you feel like it needs more sugar. I like pear butters because they don't use as much sugar as fruit butters in general. Don't use as much sugar as jellies do, and it seems a little healthier to me. Okay, I just put in a half teaspoon of nutmeg. Excuse me, I put in a whole teaspoon of nutmeg, which might be slightly more than the recipe called for, but I like nutmeg. Hopefully it's fine. And a whole teaspoon of cinnamon. The last thing is fresh ginger. I love ginger. So it calls for 2 tablespoons of fresh ginger, and I have a microplane here, and I'm just gonna grate it right in. I have already peeled my ginger, and again, I'm not actually measuring this with a measuring spoon. It will not affect the safeness of the recipe at all. So this is another thing that you can just sort of put the amount in that seems right to you. Then I might add a little more, but we'll stir all the ingredients up, put the lid on our slow cooker, and you can do this same thing with either pears or apples. My recipe is specifically for a pear spread, but these same sort of spices would taste great with apples. So you can give this recipe a try with apples if you have apples instead of pears. And definitely the method works really well. I've done apple butter in a slow cooker as well. Works really nicely. So I'm stirring it all up, and then I'm going to put the lid on, and I'm just going to let it start to cook. As I said earlier, I have it on high. It shouldn't cause any problem for scorching or cooking too fast, but I'm going to check on it throughout the day as I'm doing other projects and just see how quickly it cooks down. And then I'll be back with the next step. Looks great. It's going to smell good too all day. My pears have been cooking in the slow cooker for about 2.5 hours. So we'll see how they're doing. This has been on high. They're looking great. You can see they've gotten very soft, starting to break apart a little bit, and there's a lot of juice from the pears. It smells delicious. I'm going to let it cook at least another hour. I'll check on it then, and probably by then I'll be ready to whiz it up. My pear sauce has been cooking on high in a slow cooker for 4.5 hours now. You remember the pears were all the way up at the top, and now it's cooked down about halfway. For the last hour, I had the lid askew to allow more air to escape and for it to thicken up a little bit more. Now I'm going to whir it up using the immersion blender, and I'll see if I think it's thick enough to be all done. Right, it's all blended up. It looks real nice and smooth, but I think I'd like it to be just a little bit thicker. So I'm going to keep my crock pot on high, and I'm going to cook it with the lid off probably another hour, and I'll check back and see if the consistency's better. I'll get jars ready because I think I'll just freeze this instead of canning it. So I'll get some jars prepped for that. My pear butter has cooked for 5.5 hours. About 2 of those hours I had the lid off to let more liquid cook out, and now I'm happy with the consistency of it. So I'm going to go ahead and get it in jars, and I'm going to let these cool before I put it in the freezer. I'm choosing not to can this because it's not a very large quantity, and I just don't want to get all my canning supplies out and boil the water and everything. But if you did want to can this, and if you were making a larger batch perhaps, you could do a boiling water bath for about 15 minutes of boiling, and that would be good. When you want to freeze your jams and jellies, it's a fine way to preserve all sorts of things if you have room in your freezer. You want to make sure to leave a good amount of headspace, because especially jars like this one where they get a narrower lip, I'm actually going to take a little bit more of this out because I filled it a little higher than I want. I'm going to leave it, I'm only going to fill it to right around where it starts to narrow, because as it freezes, the liquid inside of it expands and it can break a jar in your fridge or in your freezer, which you want to try to avoid if you can. I hope this recipe for making homemade pear butter or apple butter in a slow cooker was useful to you. I ended up cooking my pear butter for 5.5 hours on high. You can do the same thing on low overnight using either apples or pears. Put all your ingredients in and cook it on low overnight. I would leave the lid on, then in the morning you can check it and see if you need to cook any more liquids off. But I've done it before, and usually it's good in the morning after 8 hours or so on low overnight. So I find this to be a really simple way to preserve some of my pears for a delicious spread that I'll get to enjoy on toast and muffins and whatever else you might want to spread your yummy fall treat on. If you've enjoyed this tutorial, check out this channel for other canning and food preserving tutorials, and I'll keep making more as the season progresses. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you're interested.